Oh, all right, Conner Habib. Conner, welcome to the show.
Hey, how you doing?
Well, I'm okay. You, my friend, I hope you're feeling pretty good. Here it is, Hawk Mountain.
Yeah.
So it's been a month. How you feeling? How's it been going?
Oh, really good. I mean, the US tour was great. I did a little over 2 weeks in the US, and
Yeah,
almost all the events were completely packed, which I'm told is
nice.
unusual for a
It is.
debut novelist. And
Yep.
then came back and I did a bunch of events in Dublin, which were all also packed. And now like there's a little bit of a breather. And so, you get into that space where you're like, you get all that rush of like attention, and then you're like, okay, wait, no, what do I do?
That's right.
So,
That's
so I'm
right.
just kind of, and the answer is you rest, but I'm not always capable of doing that. And I have a podcast that, I put out something every week. So I don't
Yep.
really have rest either, but
You
you
don't
know,
look like a guy who rests to me. I don't feel rest off of you at this point in your life. At this point in your life.
yeah,
You've
you
been
look
kind
like a
of
guy
going and
who's
going and
totally
going.
exhausted. Yeah.
Yeah. So part of the reason your shows were your events were packed is because you've written an awesome book. But I suspect
Thank
also,
you.
like you said, you have a podcast. So unlike some novelists, debut novelists, you have a what we call in the biz a platform. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when did this podcast start?
About 5 years ago. So 5 years and almost 200 episodes ago now. So
That's
yeah.
awesome. And it's been
Yeah.
going great. And so what was the inspiration for that?
I mean, that was basically, I, there were two things. One was that I just kind of was lonely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had
Yep.
all these ideas that I wanted to talk about, and I had lots of
Yeah.
friends who were doing interesting things. And so I just started inviting people on to talk about ideas with me. But the idea behind that was, to have sort of big talk instead of small talk, and
Yeah.
to really just go for it, which is what
Yeah.
I pretty much do on almost every episode. Not every single one, but almost everyone. Just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And then, everybody's like, what are you talking about? And then I sort of pull back.
All right. Hawk Mountain is your first published novel.
Mhm.
Is it your first attempted long form piece?
Yeah, I mean, I've started novels like again and again since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
So, the closest I came to, finishing something else, I wrote about 200 pages of another novel, but then I just stopped. It wasn't
How old were
doing what
you
I
when you
wanted it to do.
started that one?
What's that?
How
Oh,
old were you?
that was probably when I was like in my early 30s.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. So you were getting to the age where you actually might write a book, but
right.
didn't happen. But you eventually came to short form stuff. It sounds like short stories, but also essays and you doing periodicals. When did you start doing that work?
Yeah, I think that's, I did a lot of that because people actually commissioned me to do that work. So that was probably around 2000, and I don't know. I mean, I wrote 2007, maybe. I wrote an essay about getting beaten up by my ex-boyfriend, and that actually became like a sort of like like a viral kind of hit
Mm,
essay.
yeah.
If you ever did write anything about me, I'd want it to be about love. And in
Right.
fact, it's still like I still get email about that because
Wow.
Carmen Maria Machado like included it. Machado included in the back of her memoir as an
Wow.
influence on the memoir. And so I think like that moment kind of turned things for me where people started asking me to write essays, and
Right.
mostly the essays ended up being about sexuality, sex work, that kind of stuff. But I also ended up writing, an essay about my mom dying, and I wrote an essay about time, and so on and so forth.
Right. Were you intimidated by the concept of it or just didn't have a compelling idea? Because, it's because
Mm.
look, if you went to an MFA program and if you're a literate guy and you like to read, literate person, there is a mystique, I think, undeserved hanging over
Mm.
the novel that
Mhm.
can influence our thinking about it. Did that affect you at all?
Yeah, like especially in America, right? Like in
Yeah.
Ireland, there's not as much of a mystique around writing a book because like everybody writes a book in Ireland. Because I mean that's part of just the function of it being such a small place. But I mean, I think, yeah, did it intimidate me? I think I was always trying to find the right form.
Yeah.
We're talking about
Yeah.
Hawk Mountain. I wrote it as a short story in that MFA program.
Oh.
Um,
Oh.
and I mean, it was completely different, but the
Right.
events in the story were the same
Right.
mostly.
Right.
But I brought it in, and one of my fellow students said, "You disgust me." He hated it, and the
Right.
professor refused to like comment on it, which was
What the?
I thought
Oh,
quite
dude,
absurd.
this drives
Yeah,
me
it was
crazy, Connor. Okay. All right.
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So we can, yeah, I know, we can pull that apart, but ultimately probably good, because that meant that they had no influence on the story. And
Right.
and so I just kept thinking about it for almost 15 years. I moved to LA, in 2013 or something like that, and I was like, okay, like anybody who lives in LA, you think that the dumbest thing in the world can become a screenplay, and
Right. Right.
often like Hot Tub Time Machine, you're
Right.
right.
If it did, why
So
not? Why
yeah,
not Hawk
exactly.
Mountain?
So
Right.
I so I was like, gosh, I'm still thinking about that story. So I turned it into a screenplay, which didn't work,
Hmm.
and so like it had these two forms that didn't work, and I was like, should I make it a play? What should I do? And then finally I was just like, just write a novel. And I did, and it took me, I mean, that Hawk Mountain took me about 6 months to write after that.
So,
Yeah,
all
you
right.
were
So
just
you went
like,
out and you had full events. What was it like? What was the conversation? Speaking of conversation, that's a unique experience. You probably read some stuff, but then I don't know. Maybe you didn't. Most authors do. Then what was the nature of the conversation with the audience?
yeah, I mean, there were lots of questions about trauma,
Hmm.
lots of questions about bullying, because there's a lot of bullying in the
Yeah.
book. There were um questions about school. Um, I'm trying to think of, like, those were some of the more common ones. A lot of, I mean, the novel is alternately marketed in different places, different ways.
Oh,
So
interesting.
it's literary fiction on most shelves in the US, but it
Yeah.
can also find its way into the horror section
Yeah.
or the
Yeah.
crime section.
Yep.
And here in Ireland, and also then in the UK and Australia, it's being marketed more as literary crime or literary horror.
Yeah.
And I mean, I feel comfortable with it being anywhere, really. I feel a little weird about it being on the horror shelf. Sorry, this is answering your question in a way, but
That's okay.
I I feel a little bit weird about having being on the horror shelf, not because, I mean, horror is a huge influence on me, and I a lot of times call this a horror novel, and it's blurred by Clive Barker and
Yeah.
Ramsey Campbell and Brian Evanson, who are all big, horror writers, and Kelly Link, who's written some horror as well. But I think that it, like, if people go to the horror shelf and pick it up, hoping that it'll be like the next person on the shelf, which would be Joe Hill, who's Stephen King's
Right.
son, probably like
Yep.
alphabetically,
Yep.
they're not going to get the same experience. However, if they're open, I think they'll really love it. I feel like, if anything, I want to live up to that genre more than I think I did in the book. But I do think a lot of horror readers have been reading it and loving it. And then, of course, there's literary fiction readers who have just been like, oh, this is great. Yes, there's violence in it and there's something grotesque in it. But that's also in J.M. Coetzee and Joyce
Right.
Carol Oates and lots of other writers who just fit
Life.
right onto the,
It's in life.
yeah, exactly. Hopefully, not in anybody's life that's reading this can
Hopefully,
relate
but
to
it
what
happens.
happens. But yeah.
Yeah. I thought what your story about someone who is a fan of horror and going to a horror section, picking it up, says a lot about how we genreify, because it has to do with expectation and what do you
Yeah.
think is going to happen when you read a romance novel, a science fiction novel. I was a huge fantasy novel consumer when I was a teenager, and I had
Yeah,
an
me too.
expectation. And if it didn't meet it, that book went bad
Sure.
for the most part.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, me too. And I mean, I think that that's just kind of answering your question about, like, what was the conversation like.
Yeah.
A
What
lot of
was the?
people did ask me these questions about genre, and
Yeah.
some people were like, what is horror? Why did you choose to be
Yeah.
influenced by horror when you wrote this? And again, just to say, like, one of the reasons also is like, because a lot of these genres aren't given enough space in the store. So if there is a horror shelf at all, it's
Yeah.
usually very small.
Yeah.
So like, I I just had a long conversation about this on, there's a podcast called This Is Horror. And it was like a 2 hour long conversation.
Wow.
And we spent a lot of time talking about, like, is this good or is this bad? What are these classifications give to us? And I think that anybody who's into genre is constantly having that kind of,
Yep. Yep.
conversation. And I love and also think we need to do something about it. And I don't know what it is. I'm trying to I don't exactly know what it is,
it's it's
so
really a marketing thing. It's because it really evolved from marketing and just an easy way to help people understand what's going to happen. But the fact is, when you sit down and write a book, like you've done, if you're having an authentic expression, you don't I think the genre stuff comes afterwards. You say, okay, I've just written this thing. Now what can I tell people it is? I would think in general that is a truer way to create a work than saying, I'm going to write an upmarket contemporary literary novel aimed at women ages 13 to 50. I mean, I just don't think that's a way you can really create something. I don't think, but maybe I'm wrong, but
I'm sure some people do, but I mean,
yeah, I
I think
guess.
also the book itself, like some of the themes of the book, another thing people asked me a lot about was like the sexuality of the characters. And in this book I really try to make the sort of, I don't try to make the point, but the book does make the point sort of on its own, that like sort of nailing people down into these neat categories of who is what and what they desire and what they want, and how that should, how that leads to defining people as certain things, whether it's
Right.
gay or straight or bisexual or whatever, that these labels, which by the way are not, very old, they only date back to the, sort of mid to late 19th century, is
Mm-hmm.
like, i think I think for me, like the challenge of these sort of marketing things is weirdly in a way like embedded in the themes of
Yes, it is.
sexuality and repression in the
It is.
novel, because they end up being damaging but also could have been useful at the right moment.
Right.
So it's like, I think that's, it's like, are we doing more harm than good? Do we need these as a kind of medicine sometimes? Do we, I mean, it's all very confusing.
All right. So I'm not done with you quite yet. What I'd like you to do, you got your thinking cap on, you got your Deus Ex Machina cap on. I want you to answer this question. Finish this sentence. If writing, all the writing you've done in your life has taught you anything, it's taught you what?
Allow yourself to be free in your imagination. I mean, your imagination is capable of producing anything. So allow it the freedom that it's owed.